50,000 Roman soldiers, knowingly stepped into their own grave. They followed an order no rational commander should ever give and no sane army should ever obey, to bury themselves behind walls with no escape, surrounded on one side by 80,000 enemies starving for Roman blood, and on the other by 250,000 more marching to annihilate them. In that moment, Rome's future balanced on the edge of oblivion. Had those men broken, even for a heartbeat, the empire that would one day dominate the world would have died in the dirt of Gaul. And the mind behind this unthinkable decision, the man who dared to trap his entire army between two crushing forces, was Julius Caesar. So before we uncover why a Caesar on the brink of ruin gambled the fate of 50,000 people for an irrational method, hit the like button, so YouTube doesn't bury this story the way Caesar buried his men. Stay with me because in the next few minutes you'll discover three things. 1. The astonishing engineering trick that allowed Caesar to entomb an entire army and turn a death trap into a weapon. 2. The single moment when he stepped onto the battlefield himself and came within a breath of dying. And lastly, the final choice that forced the most powerful man in Gaul to kneel at his feet. But to understand how Caesar reached the point of burying his own legions alive, we have to return to the moment when Rome itself was nearing its breaking point. Let's start with how the crisis truly began. By the time Caesar stood before the walls of Alesia, the Roman world was already trembling beneath his feet. In Rome, senators who feared his rising power whispered in private chambers, plotting to strip him of his command the moment he showed the slightest weakness. They had waited years for an opportunity to break him, and a single defeat in Gaul would give them everything they needed. If Caesar lost his legions, he would return to Rome not as a hero but as a criminal, tried, disgraced, and very possibly executed. Yet the crisis inside Gaul was even more alarming. For 6 relentless years Caesar had conquered tribe after tribe, but conquest did not mean control. Across the entire continent, resentment boiled over. Dozens of tribes, once divided by language, rivalry, and ancient hatred, were now united in rebellion. For the first time in memory, Gaul spoke with one voice against Rome. And the consequence of failure was catastrophic. Gaul was not just another province. It was Rome's richest source of wealth, manpower, and prestige. If Caesar could not hold it, Rome would lose a vast frontier, an enormous stream of resources, and the illusion of Roman invincibility. Everything he had built, his career, his alliances, his reputation, rested on the outcome of this single campaign. A defeat here meant political ruin. Annihilation of his legions meant personal ruin. And a liberated Gaul meant a permanent stain on Roman power from which the Republic might never recover. This was not merely a military campaign. It was a struggle for Caesar's future, Rome's future, and the future of the world that would come after them. Every step he took in Gaul carried the weight of civilizations. But the real danger wasn't the Gauls, it was Caesar's own decision. Alesia itself created the kind of dilemma that could break even the greatest commander. The fortress rose on a high plateau, protected on every side by steep slopes and natural barriers that had repelled attackers for generations. At its summit waited 80,000 Gallic warriors, men hardened by years of resistance, convinced that this stronghold was unassailable. From that height, they could observe every Roman movement, every formation, every attempt to approach their defenses. But the difficulty for Caesar went far beyond the fortress walls. His own army, though composed of Rome's finest, was stretched thin across unfamiliar terrain. 10 legions were scattered among hills, river valleys, ridges, and steep inclines that made coordination slow and communication fragile. The landscape itself worked against the Roman formations that relied on precision and unity. Yet even this was not the worst of it. Reports soon reached Caesar that a vast relief force, an army gathered from nearly every tribe in Gaul, was marching toward Alesia. Estimates spoke of 250,000 warriors, perhaps more, converging on his position. This meant that Caesar faced a nightmare without precedent, a powerful enemy entrenched above him and a second, even larger enemy closing in from the open countryside. If he positioned his army against the fortress, the relief army would crush him from behind. If he faced the relief army, the defenders of Alesia would pour down the slopes and shatter his lines. He was moments away from becoming the hunted, not the hunter. It was here, studying the hills, the rivers, the fortress looming over the valleys, that Caesar understood a terrifying truth. If he did not trap the Gauls, then the Gauls would trap him. Then Caesar gave the order that changed history. It was an instruction no Roman soldier had ever heard, and none expected from a commander surrounded by enemies on every side. While any ordinary general would have searched for an escape route, attempted a retreat, or abandoned the siege entirely, Caesar chose a path so extreme that even his closest officers questioned his sanity. He commanded his men to build walls. Not in front of them, not behind them, but around everything, around the entire fortress, around the entire Roman camp, around the entire battlefield yet to come. He intended to lock the 80,000 Gauls inside Alesia, and at the same time lock his own army inside a ring of fortifications with no exit. In that moment, Caesar made the conscious decision to bury his army alive. The Romans would dig, raise timber, carve trenches, plant stakes, and erect towers until they sealed themselves inside a vast enclosure of their own creation. They would trap the enemy in Alesia, but they themselves would be trapped between the fortress and the oncoming relief host. There would be no retreat, no path to safety, no second plan. He was wagering everything, rank, reputation, survival, on the belief that Roman discipline could outmatch Gallic numbers in a confined killing ground of his own design. Those who heard the order understood immediately what it meant. They would stand between two enormous forces with their backs to wooden barriers and earthen walls built by their own hands. If either enemy broke through, the Romans would be crushed against their own fortifications with nowhere to run. This was either genius or suicide. What Caesar ordered next was not simply construction. It was the creation of the most ambitious field fortification system the ancient world had ever seen. His plan required two walls, each one vast enough to encircle an entire landscape. The first wall, the circumvallation, faced inward toward Alesia. Its purpose was simple and brutal: to imprison the 80,000 Gauls inside the fortress and prevent even a single warrior from escaping or breaking through. But the second wall, the contravallation, was the true mark of Caesar's audacity. This outer ring faced the open countryside, stretching toward the distant hills where the massive relief army would soon appear. It was designed to shield the Romans from the approaching 250,000 Gauls who intended to crush them. Caesar was effectively turning his own army into the heart of a colossal defensive machine, one that forced both enemy forces to attack Roman walls rather than Roman lines. To accomplish this, his legions embarked on a feat of engineering so extreme it seemed impossible. They carved more than 11 miles of interconnected trenches across uneven ground. One trench was dug deep enough to be filled with diverted water, forming a broad moat that stalled cavalry and infantry alike. A second trench, just behind it, was lined with sharpened stakes fixed upright in the earth. Anyone who fell into it would be impaled before reaching the rampart. Beyond these trenches lay a bewildering series of hidden traps. Thousands of narrow pits were dug in staggered rows, each containing a stake at the bottom, so concealed that an advancing warrior would not see them until he collapsed into one. These wolf pits were arranged to break formations, slow momentum, and sow terror before an attacker even reached the main defenses. Atop the central earthen rampart, the Romans built a solid palisade crowned with battlements. And at measured intervals, every 80 feet, they erected wooden towers high enough for archers and artillery crews to fire down on enemies from a commanding height. These towers turned the entire ring of fortifications into a continuous killing perimeter. And all of this was built under fire. Day and night, Gallic missiles rained down from Alesia. Stones, javelins, and arrows flew relentlessly as Roman soldiers worked without rest, shields propped above their heads, tools in one hand and weapons in the other. The ground shook with the hammering of stakes, the cutting of timber, and the constant clatter of armor as exhausted men carried out their commander's impossible order. But slowly, inexorably, the structure took shape. 15-foot ditches, walls of earth and timber, towers rising over the valleys, rings of traps waiting beneath the soil. As the final connections were made, every Roman understood what they had built. This was the burial. An entire army sealed inside a vast wooden tomb of its own creation, with enemies before them, behind them, and no way out. As the walls tightened around Alesia, desperation began to infect both armies. The Gauls trapped inside the fortress launched repeated breakout attempts, throwing thousands of warriors against unfinished sections of the Roman line. Each assault was fierce, sudden, and aimed at exploiting any weakness. But every attempt failed. The ditches stopped their cavalry, the stakes tore apart their formations, and the towers filled the killing grounds with missiles. Again and again the defenders hurled themselves at the Roman works, only to be forced back with heavy losses. Alesia was becoming a prison faster than they had ever feared. But the Romans were suffering as well. The labor of building 2 sets of fortifications had drained their strength. Fatigue spread through the ranks like a sickness. Nights brought piercing cold, and days brought unrelenting strain. Food began to run short, especially for the animals. Foraging parties sent into the countryside rarely returned unscathed. Many were ambushed by Gallic scouts or raiding bands. Every pursuit cost the Romans precious men. Every journey seeking grain or livestock risked ending in slaughter. Morale wavered. Soldiers accustomed to the certainty of Roman superiority now found themselves cut off, encircled, and sealed behind walls that offered protection, but no escape. Some whispered that Caesar had led them into a trap. Others wondered whether the relief army, rumored to be unimaginably vast, would arrive before starvation forced them to fight on empty stomachs. Among these men was a legionary named Marcus, a veteran of the campaigns in Gaul, hardened by years of battle, yet shaken by what he now faced. He had fought in open fields, in forests, and in towns, but never like this. He felt the weight of the earth they piled around themselves, the suffocating sense that with every trench and tower they were closing the door on their own survival. One night, while hauling timber to reinforce a section of the rampart, Marcus paused and looked at the towering structure rising before him. Exhausted, bruised, and chilled to the bone, he muttered words later repeated among the ranks. "We were building either our monument or our grave." It was a moment of clarity felt across the army. They understood that their survival depended not on hope but on the endurance to hold out against 2 enemies at once. If you appreciate the effort Rome's soldiers made here, do them honor. Subscribe so this history doesn't fade into the dark. At last, the moment Caesar had feared and prepared for arrived. Scouts rushed into camp with urgent reports, their faces pale with dust and dread. The relief army was no longer a rumor or a distant threat. It was here. Soon the sounds reached the Romans themselves. Horns echoing across the valleys. Rhythmic war cries rolling like thunder. The distant tremor of tens of thousands of feet striking the earth in unison. Men climbed the ramparts and peered toward the horizon. And then they saw it. A vast cloud of dust rising from the plains. Beneath it, stretching farther than the eye could follow, marched the massed host of Gaul, 250,000 warriors from nearly every tribe in the land, united for the single purpose of destroying Caesar's army. It was a sight so overwhelming that even veterans who had faced death a dozen times felt their stomachs tighten. If this force joined with the defenders in Alesia, the Romans would be swallowed whole. And this is the moment the Roman Empire almost collapsed. Silence. Because what happened next forced Caesar to risk his life in front of his entire army. The attack began with terrifying coordination. As the relief army surged toward the outer fortifications, the warriors inside Alesia hurled themselves against the inner walls at the very same moment. It was a double-pressure assault on a scale no Roman legion had ever faced. The sounds of battle erupted from every direction: shouts, metal striking wood, the rising roar of two enemy forces closing in like jaws around the Roman position. The outer wall shuddered beneath the charge of the relief host. Tens of thousands pressed forward, crashing into the traps, stumbling into hidden pits, forcing their way toward the rampart with sheer weight of numbers. Roman archers loosed volley after volley, but the attackers kept coming. Meanwhile, from the heights of Alesia, 80,000 defenders slammed into the inner line, determined to break free and join their countrymen. The Romans were fighting a siege in both directions at once. It was not long before the strain found its breaking point. At the northwest sector, a stretch of wall built across uneven, treacherous ground, Gallic warriors discovered a weakness. With incredible effort, they pushed through obstacles, filled trenches with their own bodies, and began scaling the rampart. The Roman line bent under the pressure. Centurions shouted, men locked shields to brace the impact, and still the wall groaned as if about to collapse. Word spread that the position was failing. If that section broke, the Gauls inside Alesia would pour out and join with the relief army, overwhelming the Romans in a single crushing surge. Officers rushed to Caesar with conflicting reports. The wall was holding, the wall was collapsing, reinforcements were needed, reserves were already exhausted. The situation was slipping beyond control. And then Caesar acted. He donned his crimson commander's cloak, the unmistakable symbol that marked him out on every battlefield, mounted his horse and rode directly toward the failing line. He chose not to command from a distance nor rely on messengers. He chose to be seen. As he reached the northwest sector, surrounded by exhausted, bloodied legionaries struggling to stand their ground, his presence cut through the chaos like a blade. Men who had been moments from retreat found new strength. They saw their general, marked in scarlet, riding into the heart of the crisis without hesitation. Officers straightened. Soldiers who could barely lift their shields raised them again. Cohorts that had wavered locked into formation as if welded together. Across the battlefield, a wave of energy surged through the Roman ranks. They fought harder, held longer, and refused to break, not because the situation had improved, but because Caesar himself had arrived to share their peril. But even Caesar couldn't stop what came next. The battle now reached a level of ferocity that defied anything the Romans had endured before. On the inner wall, the defenders of Alesia threw themselves forward with the desperation of men who knew their fate was sealed if they failed. Roman shields rattled under the force of repeated blows. Spears thrust upward from the slopes, blades scraped against armor, and every inch of the rampart became a battleground fought over by sheer will. Yet the Romans held. Cohorts shifted with practiced discipline, closing gaps as soon as they opened. Officers shouted orders through the chaos, directing replacements to points where the line thinned. Arrows clattered against shields, and stones hurled from Alesia's heights struck helmets with bone-shaking force, but the inner defenses endured. Meanwhile, on the outer wall, the situation became even more chaotic. The relief army pressed harder than ever, forming wave after wave of assault. Many fell into the traps or were caught in the pits, but the sheer magnitude of their numbers drove the survivors forward. Where the Romans struck down one attacker, two more forced themselves into the gap. It was here that Caesar's cavalry, held in reserve for the decisive moment, finally entered the fray. These auxiliary horsemen, especially the Germanic riders who fought with fearless aggression, executed a bold maneuver around the Roman fortifications. Galloping with ferocious speed, they swept into the flanks of the relief force, disrupting formations and forcing thousands of Gauls to turn and defend themselves against an attack they had never anticipated. The effect was immediate and devastating. The relief army, already struggling to coordinate their assault against the fortified Roman line, now found itself under attack from the side by cavalry that seemed to burst from nowhere. Confusion spread. Officers lost control of their units. Warriors attempting to scale the rampart hesitated as shouts of alarm spread through the ranks. Back at the failing northwest section, The fighting devolved into brutal close combat. Romans and Gauls clashed at arm's length, shields smashed into faces, blades hacked through exposed limbs, and men grappled atop the rampart in a desperate struggle for dominance. Some fought on their knees, others without helmets, some with broken weapons, but all fought with the full measure of their strength. It was no longer a matter of tactics. It was survival. Gradually the tide began to turn. The combined pressure of Caesar's reinforcements inside the walls, the relentless defense of the line, and the devastating cavalry attack on the flanks shook the Gallic resolve. Sections of the relief army began to buckle. Warriors shouted warnings, pointing to the collapsing flanks. Panic spread faster than orders could counter it. And then, as the Romans pressed forward with renewed fury, the Gallic formations shattered. What had been a coordinated assault dissolved into chaos. Warriors stumbled backward, colliding with those behind them. Officers tried to rally their men, but fear had overtaken discipline. With their dead piled in front of them and cavalry slicing through their flanks, the relief army began to break. A moment later, the break became a rout. Tens of thousands of Gauls turned and fled across the plain. What had been a sea of warriors became a torrent of bodies running in every direction. The Roman cavalry pursued relentlessly, cutting down stragglers and scattering entire tribes in the mist that clung to the valley. Behind them, torches flickered along the fortifications, illuminating the grim aftermath, fallen bodies, shattered shields, splintered spears, and the remnants of a battle that would be remembered for generations. With the relief army in full flight, the battlefield transformed almost instantly. The thunder of war cries gave way to the chaotic rumble of retreating footsteps, the clatter of discarded weapons, the distant shouts of Roman cavalry driving the fugitives farther and farther from the field. What had marched toward Alesia as the greatest united force in Gallic history now dissolved into scattered fragments, each tribe fleeing in panic, each chief struggling to salvage what remained of his warriors. Inside Alesia, the defenders watched the catastrophe unfold. They saw the relief host, their final hope, disappear into the horizon under the pressure of Roman pursuit. The realization swept through the fortress like a cold wind. No reinforcements were coming. No rescue would cut through the Roman walls. They were alone, surrounded, and completely sealed within Caesar's fortifications. Gauls who had fought with relentless fury only hours earlier now stood in stunned silence. The slopes around their walls were littered with the bodies of those who had attempted to break free. Their food stores were nearly gone. Their wounded lay everywhere. And beyond the trenches and towers, the Roman lines stood unbroken. Caesar understood that the battle was no longer a battle. It was the final act. He ordered his legions to tighten their formation, to seal every point around the fortress, and to prepare for the inevitable surrender. No Roman soldier celebrated. The exhaustion was too deep, the cost too evident, and the weight of what they had achieved too heavy to grasp in the moment. From Caesar's position, one could see the entire scope of the siege, the inner walls trapping the Gauls, the outer walls that had repelled the relief army, and the legions arrayed in silent readiness, closing the circle with impenetrable precision. This is where the fate of Western civilization is sealed. At dawn, the gates of Alesia opened for the final time. No war cries followed, no desperate charge, no last attempt to break free. Instead, a single figure emerged, mounted, armored, and carrying the weight of an entire nation's hopes upon his shoulders. It was Vercingetorix, the man who had done what no Gallic leader before him had accomplished. He had united tribes divided by centuries of rivalry, welded them into a single cause, and brought Rome to the edge of ruin. Now he descended the slope in solemn silence, passing the remnants of the battlefield that had decided the destiny of Gaul. As he approached the Roman lines, he dismounted. He removed his armor, piece by piece, laying aside the symbols of his authority and his defiance. Every movement was deliberate, heavy with meaning. He walked forward alone until he stood before Caesar, who remained seated, expression unreadable, surrounded by the legions that had survived the impossible. Then the Gallic chieftain knelt. It was a moment that captured the turning of an age. The man who united Gaul fell to the man who buried his own army alive to survive. The surrender of Vercingetorix marked more than the end of a siege. It marked the collapse of organized Gallic resistance. One by one, the tribes that had risen in defiance submitted to Roman authority. Within months, Gaul, once a vast mosaic of independent peoples, became a Roman province. Roads, garrisons, and administrators spread across the land that had fought so fiercely to remain free. For Caesar, the victory was nothing short of transformative. No general in Roman history had ever conquered so vast a territory with such audacity and precision. The triumph at Alesia silenced his political enemies, elevated his prestige to unprecedented heights, and cemented his authority over legions who would follow him across any frontier. It granted him the power and fame that would soon bring him into direct conflict with the Roman Senate. The consequences echoed far beyond Gaul. This victory laid the foundation for the chain of events that reshaped the ancient world. Caesar's rising dominance led to the political crisis that erupted into civil war. His triumph paved the way for the rise of his heir, Octavian, later known as Augustus, who transformed the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire, in turn, reshaped Europe for centuries, carrying Latin language, Roman law, and Roman identity across an entire continent. Alesia was not simply a military victory. It was a hinge of history. If Caesar failed at Alesia, there would be no Roman Empire, no Latin languages, no Western Europe as we know it. Sometimes history isn't shaped by victory, but by the moment someone chooses to risk everything. At Alesia, Caesar wagered his life, his army, and the fate of Rome on a plan so reckless that it bordered on madness. Yet it was that very willingness to stand at the edge of disaster that redirected the course of civilization. Empires rise not only from triumph, but from the audacity of individuals who refuse to accept the limits placed before them. If you want YouTube to keep recommending real history, not the watered-down version, like the video, comment, Rome, and subscribe. You keep this knowledge alive, not the algorithm.